back. Caroline Glick is in the house virtually, I'm very pleased to say, coming to us from Jerusalem in the Holy Land of Israel. She is telling us in, I think, the needed detail about the various forces that are currently operating inside Israel and from outside of it that are really threatening the peace of Jerusalem, something that is being prayed for by many of us every day, but particularly today when the Jerusalem prayer breakfast is taking place there. And Carolyn, you were laying out the problem arising from the Arab quarter, if you will, the Arab sector. And there are quite a number of Israeli Arabs as well as Palestinians, to say nothing of others in the general vicinity. And to the extent that they are being incited, as you say, this has given rise to real threats to Israelis inside Israel itself from people who have, the right to be in Israel, not Palestinians that are, supposed to be, restricted in terms of their movements there. Just discuss that very briefly, if you will, and then we'll move through some of the other contributing factors to the challenges
So,
Israel's facing at
all
the
right.
moment.
So just to tie up the thing about incitement. So you
Yeah.
have a society, a Palestinian Arab society, which now encompasses also large swaths of Israel's Arab community,
Mhm.
um, which makes up about 20% of the country, and we're talking about maybe three quarters of Israeli Arabs, mainly the Muslims, and they are mobilized to annihilate Israel. It's not a society at peace. It's a society that exists for war. It identifies and organizes itself as a society towards not the goal of establishing a Palestinian state so much as annihilating the Jewish state. And we
Mhm.
see it in a whole host of ways. So when you have this kind of society and they're incited to believe that their mosques are endangered or that the Jews are desecrating sacred areas to them, then it acts like a match
Mhm.
in a
Tinderbox.
field of,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
in a tinderbox, and it blows up. And so we've seen, just regarding Israeli Arabs. I mean, last year, a year ago, last May and June, we had massive pogroms by Israeli Arabs in mixed Arab Jewish cities like Lod, like Akko, like Haifa, like Jaffa, and Jerusalem, where you had actual lynchings of Jews. You had Jewish
Mhm.
businesses, Jewish homes, Jewish cars, Jewish schools, synagogues that were torched by Arab mobs. And these are people who are the neighbors of the Jews they were targeting.
Right.
You had one of Israel's top scientists and missile developers was burned alive while sitting in a hotel that was set aflame in the mixed Jewish Arab city of Akko in northern Israel. So,
Mhm.
we've had a lot. We That was the start of this thing, and the problems basically settled down, the violence more or less abated, but it's always been on a low flame.
Mhm.
And in March and in April, we had a series of four murderous terrorist attacks throughout the country. Two of them were carried out by Israeli Arab citizens, and
Wow.
two by Palestinian Arabs from Samaria.
Yeah.
So
Carolyn, I do
we're
want to move
talking
on.
about a much raised profile of Israeli Arabs in
Yeah,
the war against
I just
Israel.
want to mention before we move on, a colleague of yours and mine, Itamar Marcus with Palestinian Media Watch, has done a wonderful job of documenting this incitement, including in the schools, where
Mhm.
the children are being inculcated with this jihadism against Israel. Talk about the Israeli left, and maybe you might just mention the role that Israeli Arab parties play in the
Right.
Israeli left
So
as well.
for the past year, Israel has been governed by a government comprised of sort of never Netanyahu right wing factions that defected from the right to form a governing coalition with very radical left wing parties, center left wing parties, and then finally with the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Israel. And so this is the most radical governing coalition Israel's ever seen, by far. It's ostensibly led by right wing defector Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who was until he did this, he was a friend of mine. But he broke he went over the lines to the other side, and he formed this government. At any rate, so the Israeli left essentially many aspects of it, and I think you see it in the United States as well, that many uh, voices in the American left have actually become anti-American. It's not that they're talking about workers' rights or other blue-collar issues the way that the old left used to, but rather they've become cultural Marxists along the lines that Mark Levin lays out in his book, and they actually hate the United States and what it stands for. And we've had that similar parallel radicalization of the Israeli left over the past several decades, to the point where many of the left's leaders in Israel have internalized the anti Semitic canard that there's something racist about Zionism, the Jewish National Liberation
Wow.
movement. So, just as the left in the United States considers the United States to have been born in the sin of slavery and to be
Hmm.
systemically racist, and has to expiate its guilt in various ways, basically through embracing a communist agenda.
Right.
So
Destroying
in
the
the United
country.
States,
Mm.
right? So that's tearing America apart. So in Israel, we have a left that sides with the or has internalized the enemy's narrative against Israel, so that uh, when we had Arab rioters on the Temple Mount last week, or fear that they would riot, because they had been rioting before Jerusalem Day, which celebrates the unification of Jerusalem in the Six Day War in 1967, we had one of the far left ministers in the government saying that whereas Arab rioters at Israeli universities had been waving the PLO flag, calling for the annihilation of Israel, she said that this was a sign of peace, and that Jews waving flags in the old city of Jerusalem, Israel's capital, is a provocation. So we've had that as
Wow.
well, and we're having a bit of that. So
And
that's
again,
also a
this is
problem.
this is a government minister under the present government. Is that right?
Right, right.
Wow.
And the problem here is that all of this is taking place with the facilitation of both the European Union and the
Mm.
United States, that are ostensibly Israel's allies. So the
Yeah.
EU is the most radical force in this. Last week, it was reported, not for the first time, but still, that the European Union has invested $1 billion in a program called Jerusalem 2030. And its purpose, and it's already being implemented in many places on the ground, is to undermine and subvert Israeli sovereignty, not only in Jerusalem, but its environs in the west, the east, the north, and the south. The goal is to destroy several Jewish cities, several Jewish neighborhoods inside of Jerusalem, and seize the land for the Palestinians. A lot of this is being carried out by illegal seizures of land. The European Union plan, which is being implemented by a UN agency called Habitat for the Palestinians, involves working to undermine the Oslo agreements, which are the peace agreements by virtue of which the Palestinian Authority was established in 1993. So they're actually trying to abrogate the peace agreements that Israel signed with the Palestinians, with the PLO 25 years ago, in favor of a Juden Palestinian state and the destruction of a Jewish Jerusalem. And this is a European Union plan. It's actually an act of war against Israel that they're enacting.
Yeah. Caroline, we need to take a short break. I want to come
Mhm.
back to this and also have you tease out this term that you've used now twice, Judenrein. That, of course, is
Mhm.
a reference to the Nazi German approach to trying to engage in the final solution of Jews living
The
in,
eradication of Jewry.
yeah, Jewry, particularly in Germany, but also, of course, wherever else the Third Reich established its dominion, and worldwide if they could. This is a shocking thing to be happening, needless to say, in the Jewish state itself, and at the hands of, as you said, some of its own leaders in government at the moment, in parliament, in the leftist factions, to say nothing of what the Europeans are up to. So we're going to come back to that concept and how the Europeans are doing all of this, seizures or other machinations to essentially drive the Jews out of Jerusalem, among other places. We'll be right back with much more with Caroline Glick of the Center for Security Policy right after this.